So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon from wherever you are joining us. Welcome to this expert talk on inclusive climate action. I would suggest we wait another 2 or 3 minutes to allow all the people to join that would like to join. And in the meantime, I can maybe already familiarize you with our netiquette, our housekeeping rules. But before I do so, maybe let me tell you that this expert talk is in English, but we have translation into French available, and you can find the information how to access the French translation in the chat. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Je voudrais également souhaiter le bienvenue aux participants et participantes francophones. Cette discussion d'experts sera en anglais, mais nous avons une traduction en français disponible. Vous trouvez toutes les informations sur la façon comment d'accéder et utiliser la traduction dans le chat. So I will continue to speak in English only because we have our translation available for the Francophone participants. So let me move on to our netiquette for this expert talk. And I would actually already, as a first point, ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute their microphones during this expert talk. Obviously, we are very interested to hear from you if you have any questions or want to make contributions. There will also be dedicated time for question and answers on the inputs of our experts. So please use the chat function to ask your questions and make your contributions. Please also note that this expert talk is recorded because we want to make it available also to participants or actors or whoever is interested in listening to this expert talk that don't have the time to join right now. So we would kindly ask you for your consent. Just an info, if you do not turn on your camera, both your face and your name will not be visible anywhere. If you do not consent to that, then I would kindly ask you to leave the webinar. And last but not least, we would also kindly ask you to refrain from using AI note takers. So we might also remove any AI note takers if we find them in the participants list. So just as an information also on that note. Yes, let me already move on to the agenda for today. We have about 75 to 90 minutes for this expert talk on inclusive climate action, which is part of a series of expert talks that the Agribusiness facility, the project of GIZ I'm working with, is organizing. So this is expert talk number 4 already. We focus on inclusive climate action today. So after a short opening from our side, we are very delighted to be able to welcome 2 experts that will provide input today. So the first input will be by Nicholas Sitko, who is working with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and he will present the key findings of a very interesting report of FAO called the Unjust Climate, and he will focus on how wealth, gender, and age impact rural people's vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change. Obviously, afterwards, we will have time for a discussion on that input before we move on to the second input, which will be provided by Frederick Benet Frimpong, who is the CEO of Farming in Africa from Ghana. We will get more information on that organization later on, and he will focus on how inclusive climate action can look in practice, in particular building on social media to promote that inclusive climate action. And obviously there will also be room for discussion with Fred before we close that meeting. Yes, and I think then we are already ready to move on for the opening. And for this opening, I would like to hand over to Magnus Schmid, who is the head of project of the Agribusiness Facility for Africa, the GIZ project that we are working with. So Magnus, over to you for the opening remarks.
Yes, thank you, Regina. This is really a pleasure and honor to open this webinar now. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, agriculture means working in nature and with its resources. A business in the agricultural sector is highly impacted by weather and climate, and therefore also by climate change. This is also true for several countries in the global south affected by the negative impacts of a changing climate. For example, while northern Ghana is currently experiencing the worst drought in decades, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria must face record-breaking floods. At the same time, we see unsustainable agricultural systems that contribute to climate change themselves. Agriculture, forestry, and other land uses account for nearly 20% of all human induced greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change has an impact of everyone, but some groups are even more affected by a changing climate, including women and young people. This is also true for agriculture and agribusinesses. For instance, rural women and youth often have a more limited access to advisory services, finance, and inputs. This impacts not only their agribusiness activities in general, but also their adaptive capacities in the context of changing climate. Empowering women and young people are not just key to address their particular vulnerability, but also essential to tap their full potential as important actors of change and innovators. This is also true when it comes to increasing climate resilience of agriculture value chains. The Agribusiness Facility for Africa, commissioned by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and co-funded by the European Union Directorate General for International Partnerships under the Samoa Agreement with the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States, aims to develop and enhance the capacities of actors along ACP agricultural value chains to attract finance and investment, in particular towards low emission and climate resilient practices and value chains. In this context, a particular focus is put on inclusion and empowerment of women and youth. Against this background, I'm looking forward to learn more about how persons' wealth, gender, and age influence their climate vulnerability from Nicolas Sitko, senior economist at FAO and lead author of the recent FAO report, The Unjust Climate. I'm also delighted to welcome Frederick Bene Frimpong, CEO and founder of Farming in Africa, Ghana, representing the multi-actor partnership Livestock Value Chain Intervention Initiative, supported by ABF, our project. I wish the event a good and fair discussions as well as successful outcome. Thank you very much, and back to you, Regina.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for those opening remarks. I'm also delighted and very excited to hear more from our experts. So without further ado, I would say I hand over to Nick for his presentation on the unjust climate. So let me stop sharing so you can also put up your presentation, and then over to you, Nick, whenever you are ready to start your input.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Regina and Magnus, for that introduction. Let me just swap my screen here once I get this in full presentation mode. And you should now be seeing my full screen. Is that right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you again. Very happy to be here today. What I'm going to be presenting is really a very much a data-driven report that's going to help us to put some kind of hard numbers on the ways in which climate events, both extreme weather events and long-term changes in the climate, are disproportionately affecting subpopulations in rural areas. Particularly looking at people who are living in poverty, rural women, and youth. I just want to highlight, I'm presenting this on behalf of my team that worked several years to put this together, and very happy to have the opportunity to share it with you and really use it as a springboard to spark discussions in terms of the kind of programmatic work that you all do to make them more inclusive and effective. So, the objective of the report is really coming out of this kind of increasing recognition that we see coming out of, for example, the IPCC report from 2022, which is increasingly highlighting this fact that the vulnerability of people to climate change can differ substantially within regions, between regions, and that those differences are really strongly rooted in historical processes, but also these kind of what they call intersecting patterns of socioeconomic development, some people being included and some people left out, inequality and marginalization. And that in order for us to achieve our climate objectives, which is to really transition towards a more climate resilient, but also emissions reducing pathway, we need integrated and inclusive system solutions that address specifically these issues of equity and social and climate justice. One person said to me, the foundation of the climate crisis is inequality, and the only way to solve that crisis is to address inequality. But what's important to note is, as we kind of think about this, is that we talk a lot about these inequalities, but oftentimes we tend to lump it all together. We're going to work with the vulnerable, which are women, youth, indigenous people, et cetera, and as if they're a homogenous group, and of course they're not. And we don't really have strong numbers, particularly across multiple countries, to help us understand how these differences in vulnerability manifest, what are their magnitudes, and what is the nature of their vulnerability. So that's what this report seeks to at least begin a discussion around. So let me talk very quickly about the data that we're using for the analysis. What we did was we brought together data sets that come from 24 low and middle income countries. Many of them are in Africa, but we have countries from around the world. And these data sets they're nationally representative household surveys. They cover, in terms of rural households, because we're focusing only on rural households in these surveys, they cover almost 110,000 separate households, which are statistically representative of 950 million people. So almost 1 billion people are represented in this analysis. What we've been able to do is take the information in these surveys and the geographic location of the people who responded to the surveys, and we link that in space and time. So the timing of the survey, the location of the individual, to geo-referenced climate data, which we've worked with. This is daily precipitation and temperature data that we've developed, covering a period of over 70 years. So that's one of the kind of major innovations that we've developed here. And I'm happy to answer more questions on the data themselves, but really this presentation is going to focus much more on the results. But before we jump into the results, what I want to do is kind of lay the foundation for us to think a little bit about how climate change may affect people differently, particularly in rural areas. Now, I think in general terms, we can think of the effects of climate change and these associated extreme weather events as having direct or indirect impacts on rural people. So the direct impacts are going to come through the effects on agriculture productivity. Now, those may be major disruptions in production, or they may be long-term declines in productivity as a result of long-term changes in climate and ecosystems. They can also directly affect labor productivity. You can imagine, for example, working in extreme heat conditions in agriculture is extremely challenging, and in fact can be fatal for some people. So, you know, these types of changes can affect the extent to which people can work and their productivity, particularly in these more exposed types of work. And of course, they can also disrupt the ecosystems that agriculture systems rely on. They can change temperatures, they can spread pests and diseases to new geographic areas, saltwater intrusion into other places. There's a lot of ways in which climate change is affecting ecosystems. But of course, now those are going to have indirect impacts. Now, most people in rural areas, their livelihoods are tied to the agri-food system. And I know many of you guys work in value chains that surround the production side of particular commodities. So the indirect impacts are also very important. So we can think of the effects that these events are going to have on prices. They're going to change the prices for commodities. They may push them up, they may push them down. They may change the prices of labor. So people may have, there may be more people looking for work, which is going to push down labor prices as farm production gets disrupted. So of course, having effects on non-farm opportunities. They can shift household structures because people might migrate away. Young people, for example, may leave the household. And of course, they're going to damage infrastructure, which all of these rural communities rely on to connect people to markets and services, et cetera. Now, these direct and indirect impacts are going to affect people in very different ways. For example, people who are living in poverty, who may have less access to land, who may have farming systems that are much more kind of focused on a single staple food crop, who have fewer resources, access to credit, services, et cetera, they're going to be much less capable of adopting adaptive practices, of diversifying their livelihoods to manage climate risk than non-poor people, right? So there also tend to be net food consumers, right? They don't produce enough for their own consumption, so they're going to be affected by prices as well, in a different way than people who have more resources. Women, for example, may face structural barriers that are related to discriminatory gender norms that may push women out of the workplace, that may make it more difficult for them to control and access resources, that may place a much higher time burden in terms of the amount of time that they have to dedicate to care responsibilities and unpaid work in the household. So again, these gendered norms may shape people's climate vulnerability in very different ways. And then age, of course, is also going to have an effect. Now, on the one hand, and the way it goes is quite complicated. You know, on the one hand, older people may have much more experience, much more resources to cope with climate events. But they also may not have the same kind of access to digital technologies, the same ability to migrate away and find new source of employment. They also may be much more sensitive to heat. Older people are much more sensitive to heat, for example, which may undermine their productivity. So in all these different ways, we may expect that climate is going to affect people in very different ways based on their wealth, their gender, and their age. So let's look at the evidence. So let's start with the findings that we have in terms of the effects of extreme weather events and long-run climate change on poor versus non-poor households. And our results are quite stark. What we find is that in an average year, based on long-term averages in terms of extreme heat and extreme precipitation events, we find that every year extreme heat is reducing the incomes of poor households 5% more than non-poor households. And in terms of extreme precipitation, 4.4% more. So that's suggesting a widening of the income gap as a result of these events. And when we put those into monetary terms, they're actually huge. We're talking across all low and middle income countries. In an average year, heat events creating a gap between poor and non-poor households of about $20 billion, and extreme precipitation events about $21 billion. So quite massive, both at a household and at aggregate level. We also look at long-run changes in temperature, and what we find is interesting is that as temperatures increase by 1 degree more Celsius on average per year, poor households tend to become more reliant on agriculture income than non-poor households, and less able to access non-farm work than non-poor households. So what that means is that they're becoming much more dependent on climate-sensitive agriculture as a result of long-term changes in temperature, making them, again, more vulnerable to future stresses. Okay, so let's now look at the gender dimension. Now, first, we're going to look at a household level. And in this case, we're going to look at women-led households compared to male-led households. But then we'll get into some data on individual women compared to men. So, so in terms of female-headed households, we find that heat stress is reducing their income in an average year 8% more than male-headed households, and flooding or extreme precipitation by 3% more. So again, heat stress is a huge one here. $37 billion a year across all low and middle income countries in terms of the gap between male and female-headed households, and about $16 billion due to extreme precipitation. Long-run changes in temperature also having a very negative effect on female-headed households. We see with a 1 degree temperature, 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, a 34% reduction in the total income of female-headed households, and most of that coming through agriculture income losses. So, you know, really kind of highlighting the need to support more adaptive capacities in the agriculture sector for women. But let's look now at particularly at women workers and women's fields. Now, here we're not looking at all 24 countries. We're looking only at a subset of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we found is that extreme weather events are increasing the work burden of women substantially more than men, up to about an hour more per week that they're working as a result of these extreme weather events. Now, what's interesting is that when we look at the adoption of some climate smart agriculture practices, such as soil water conservation, legume intercropping, and some others, we find that in response to extreme weather events, plots of land that are managed by women are adopting these practices at about the same rate as men. Okay, so women farmers are adopting these practices in response to climate stresses. But it remains the fact that because their labor is more constrained, because their resources are more constrained, the actual production that they are producing is much more sensitive to these events. So 1 additional day of extreme heat reduces the value of crops produced on a woman's plot 3% more than on a man's crop or in a man's field. And one final, I think, important point, this is not gender related, but it's tied to it, and that is that when extreme weather events happen, children also work more. And they work more in a similar way to women, in the sense that as women are being pulled into working longer hours to deal with these events, children are as well. And it's coming at a cost of education and play and those things that are so important. Now, finally, let's look at the evidence on age. And what's interesting is we often talk about the youth and how sensitive they are and how vulnerable they are to climate events and climate change. And that is true in the sense that their future is much more, they will face much more extreme weather events than previous generations. But in the immediate term, the evidence shows that it's actually older rural households that lose much more when these climate events happen. And that is because young people have the ability, or they exhibit a much higher ability to access non-farm income compared to older households. So while heat events so what we find is that heat events, for example, in every year are going to increase the incomes of young households compared to older households by 6%. and flooding by 3%, driven almost always by off-farm income. So while they may lose more in the farm, they're accessing non-farm opportunities. And that's really important, I think, for the type of work that you do. So now just in terms of policies, and so we've really kind of highlighted the magnitude of the challenge, but the fact is that in terms of financing and policies, there's not nearly enough attention going to this challenge. So, in 2018, only 3% of total tracked climate financing targeted the agriculture sector, and a very small percentage of that went to actual small-scale farmers. It amounts to about $10 billion, which, as you can see, is not even enough to compensate for the losses that some of these groups are facing. When we looked at the policies of the 24 countries that we included in this report, so we looked at their nationally determined contribution documents and their national adaptation plans, we identified 4,164 specific climate actions that these countries were committing to take. Only 6% of them mentioned women, only 2% mentioned young people, 1% people living in poverty, and 6% mentioned farmers. So very little attention, and some place where we need to really focus. Now, in terms of kind of the policy priorities, I think the main thing that comes out of this study is that people's vulnerabilities are very distinct and diverse. They differ by who they are, what kind of social group they belong to, as well as the type of stress that they're being exposed to. But the fact is that the impacts are coming through the farm and through the off-farm. So we can't treat these things as separate. We need to think much more integrated approaches, many kind of multi-dimensional approaches. So just to kind of a few key highlights that I think come out is we need to really focus on addressing disparities in terms of access to resources. So that's access to land, access to adaptive technologies, access to services. These are stark disparities in these populations, and we need to be explicit about it. We can't just assume that poor people can access these things in the same way as better off households. We need to think about how we improve the delivery of climate services, extension services. How do we make sure that women are able to participate in these? There's been some evidence, for example, that providing childcare at farmer field schools can allow women to much more actively participate than where they're burdened with having to take care of their children. So thinking very innovatively about how we make these appropriate for people who face different types of challenges. We need to think about reducing risks and losses. So thinking about anticipatory actions, thinking about social protection programs, thinking about the loss and damage fund that's being developed now. All those are kind of mechanisms that we need to build into supporting people so that when these events happen, they don't lose so much. And where you guys are focusing on off-farm opportunities. And so that can be sort of nuts and bolts thing, like education, like building a better business environment. But it also can be much more micro. It can be about using gender transformative approaches to help women, better navigate these, typically male-dominated sectors, or building soft skills, these kind of socio-emotional skills, so people are better at negotiating and advocating for their needs. And we need to think of beyond just material support and explicitly address some of these discriminatory norms, bring them out in the open, discuss them, and find local solutions to overcome them. So just in summary, we need to try to work on translating this evidence into policies, investments, and programs that are explicitly not trying to not leave anyone behind. So policies that acknowledge people and their vulnerabilities, investments that deal with the disproportionate losses that more vulnerable people experience and enable them to take adaptive actions, and actions that challenge and make visible kind of social norms and historical legacies that have left people more vulnerable than others. So with that, I want to thank you very much. If you want to access the report, you can do it through this QR code in the corner. So I'll leave that up for just 1 second, and then I will stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this very comprehensive overview of the key findings of the report. And I can just encourage each and every one of you to have a look at this report. I've done so many times, consulted it quite often. So if you want to learn more about this impact of climate change, be it on rural people, but then also have like this more specific look, not just, and I really like this point, Nick, that you said, it's often that we have like this homogeneous group, the vulnerable, or that we merge women and youth because they have similar challenges, but really to break that down, this overall awareness that women and youth and maybe also the poor have those challenges, but then look at the different groups in more detail and have the hard facts on how climate vulnerability looks for them and how those characteristics, the age, the gender, and also the wealth impact their vulnerability to climate change. It's really a really nice report, I can say, and I can also put the link in the chat in a second as well. In the meantime, obviously also if you have any questions, please come in right now. You can post your questions in the chat or also raise your hand if you have any questions on what we have just heard. In the meantime, maybe I can start off with one question, because also one point that I found quite interesting when having a look at all the facts is that often, and this is not only true when it comes to climate vulnerability, but in general, we really focus on the challenges that come with, for example, the impact of climate change. But as you have already pointed out, when we have a look at youth, we would generally also assume that their challenges are maybe bigger because of the impact of climate change, while the data in the report shows that they often find ways on how to cope better with this impact because they find ways on how to access like off-farm jobs. So maybe can you say how, when it comes to programming and projects, how can we maybe better take into consideration not only to focus on the challenges but also the opportunities, and maybe you have like an example from the report or the data that you collected that can maybe illustrate that a bit better.
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's all very context specific, right? And it has to do with the events, et cetera. But I think that there is some kind of promising information that comes out of this report that we as people working in the field or working with governments can kind of build on. People are doing these things. How can we support them more? And I think that this finding around young people and their off-farm opportunities is the ways in which they use off-farm opportunities to help them build more resilient livelihoods is an important one. We actually quantified the value of that, and it's in the area of about $37 billion a year for heat stress alone. That young people are contributing $37 billion more a year in these events to the basically to the non-farm economy when these events happen. So how can we support them better? Well, obviously, it's about being preemptive in the sense that we need them to have the skills to enter those labor markets in ways that are not acts of desperation, but are more strategic ways of entering into either work or self-employment that provide a good pathway, out of poverty for them. So working on skills, working on these socio-emotional skills have been shown to have a very kind of positive effect on young people's ability to negotiate labor arrangements, to negotiate their own business opportunities, their engagement with value chains. So it's more than just, well, we need to give them resources, we need to give them finance, we need to give them credit. We really need to combine it with the skills to use those better. And so making that kind of long-term investment in things that are not as tangible, but tend to be very beneficial, I think are important. I think what we see is a lot of work that is created in the wake of natural disasters, particularly floods, tend to be very short-term type work, so, and these tend to be male dominated. So when there's recovery efforts and things like that. We're now doing a study where we're looking more at these intersections between gender and age. And we're finding that floods, for example, we see a sharp increase in men's off-farm work, but a decrease in women's off-farm work. Women are pushed into the farm, men are able to find that off-farm work. And it's because of the nature of the work. So we need to, I think, also work with governments and work with communities to think about how we can make those opportunities more broadly shared across men and women as well. How do we create jobs in the wake of these things that are not just beneficial for young men, for example? So it's not concrete examples, but it's more things that we should think about.
Yeah, thank you very much also for that, I think, very important remark, like coming from a project that has human capacity development at heart, that really believes in building the capacities of women and youth and rural farmers and all actors along the value chain. It's really key to always consider that, yes, it's important to also have like the economic impacts or aspects in mind to foster like entrepreneurial and technical skills, but also those soft skills that are really key to make a change. We should or must not forget about them. There is one question in the chat, more on the data, which is how was poor and non-poor been defined in this report? Maybe you can say a sentence or two.
It's important. It's very important, actually. So, we have monetary poverty data with this, but the thing about using monetary poverty for this kind of analysis is that people's incomes are going to be affected by the shock itself. It's going to affect prices, it's going to affect production, it's going to affect those things. So we're not defining people in terms of a monetary poverty threshold. What we're using instead is a multidimensional poverty index, which accounts for various dimensions of people's well-being. It accounts for their education, the quality of their dwelling, their access to communication technologies, their access to sanitation, and access to electricity. And what we did then was we took the bottom 25% of that index for each country. So poverty is defined within a country as people who are at the bottom 25% of this multi-dimensional poverty index. So these people may or may not be monetary poor, but they are certainly sensitive to poverty.
Thank you very much also for that background information, which is probably key. I can see another question popping up in the chat, which says, thank you for this clear presentation. There would be one question about a daily work increasing for women and young persons. I would like to know if this change is noted for all the year, or is it only during a specific period? And I assume it's like during maybe harvest season. And then also for men, is the daily work time increased too? So can we see there an increase for men too, or is it the same even the climate change's effects? I'm not quite sure on the last part, but I think it goes in the direction if we can also see like similar impacts on men and how they differ maybe from women and men, and how it differs from like the different periods when it comes to the agricultural work.
Yeah, and so we didn't get into it in this report. I mean, we did a little bit into the gender component, and now we're looking also at the age component. So in general, it differs a little bit by the type of event. So women are working more in general across many of these events, but so are men responding. But what sectors they're going into varies a little bit. So what we've seen, for example, is that men are working more off farm after a flood, while women are working more on their own farm. And the opposite is true for extreme heat. Young men are working much more on the farm, sustaining production, while women are moving off farm, moving out of agriculture into what are mostly non-farm businesses. Men are taking on a lot of the kind of seasonal agriculture work in response to climate stress, but not always. And so we are disentangling that a little bit more in a paper that will be coming out. Actually, we're going to be launching next year a rural youth report And so we'll have that in there. And there is a French version. Okay, good. Yeah, you shared the French version of the summary.
Yes, exactly. So also the Francophone can have an overview of the main findings. Maybe as a last question, if there is none from the audience, I would have, because you also just showed it at the very end that when it comes to climate finance, what we can see is that only like a very small part of the climate finance available is directed towards agriculture and smallholder farmers in general. And then if we break that down, women and youth specific climate finance is like a very small portion. So maybe building on the evidence and data you collected with your report, how can we maybe use that to really advocate for more climate finance that is also youth and women specific?
I mean, so this is, I think, where the hard work of working with countries, and right now we're at kind of a unique moment in the sort of cycle of the climate policy world, and that is that countries right now are reformulating and will resubmit their nationally determined contribution documents. They do that every 5 years to the UNFCCC. So they're doing that right now, and that basically becomes the roadmap for the policy priorities that a country lays out to address the climate challenge. Now, much of it is focused on mitigation, and of course, there's a lot of mitigation potential in agriculture, but it also focuses on adaptation. And so making sure that countries recognize the magnitude of this challenge and the ways in which women and men are affected differently, poor and non-poor are affected differently, not only in terms of their vulnerability, which is the focus of this report, but also in their ability to participate in and benefit from mitigation actions in that transition process. We're talking much more about just transitions in agri-food systems now. So how do we make sure people are not left behind when we start shifting production systems to more climate adaptive or climate mitigating type systems? And so what, you know, the way in which we're going to get more climate financing to this challenge is by making sure that it's built into countries' nationally determined contribution documents, that they recognize the challenge and then therefore can advocate for financing for it.
Thank you very much. So it's also key to not forget that policy dialogue is important too, and to also make that point that inclusive climate action is really worth focusing on when it comes to all of the dimensions of sustainability and really working towards the sustainable transformation of agri-food systems that, then really benefit all actors along the value chains. Great. I think if we have no further questions, I would like to thank you once again for your input and all the very interesting findings that you can find in this very interesting report. And then I would suggest we move on to our second input, which is provided by Frederick Benet-Frimpong. He's the CEO and founder of Farming in Africa in Ghana, and also represents one of the multi-actor partnerships that ABF provides support to in the context of a matching grant fund. Fred, are you ready for your input? And then also let me know if you want to share your presentation yourself or if you want me to provide support to you.
Yes, I'm ready. I don't mind, whichever way is easier for you.
Same here.
Oh, okay.
So do you want me to share for you?
Sure, you can if that's okay.
Or do you prefer to do it yourself?
I can do it myself.
Okay, perfect. Then, Fred, over to you. We are very happy to have you with us today and learn more about how inclusive climate action can then also look in practice. And we are also very happy to hear more from you because you're very experienced on using social media. So, Fred, over to you.
Thank you very much. If you give me a minute, I will share my screen and Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And it's a great privilege to be in the midst of all of you and share um, our inputs on climate change and also the work that we are doing here in Ghana, but across Africa and beyond on how we can together come and combat the impact and our activities or actions towards climate change. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for the amazing presentation. Learned a lot from that, and we will also take that into practice as we move on to our next endeavors. I want to start by introducing our company, which is Farming in Africa. So Farming in Africa is based in Ghana with locations or teams in Nigeria, Uganda, and South Africa. And for the past 5 years, our vision really has been revolutionizing the livestock industry across the continent. Because when you look back into how livestock farming is done, even 50 years back, 100 years back, there hasn't been a lot of innovation and change in terms of how it is done because of how number one is positioned and how non-attractive it is to the young ones coming up. Because if you can close your eyes and picture an African livestock farmer, mostly what you can see is big horns, cows roaming around and followed by one or two gentlemen. And this is not the most attractive picture that a young, educated woman or man wants to venture into it. And those that even go the small ruminant way do not consider themselves as livestock farmers. Why? Because it is domesticated and therefore there's no commercial sort of sense around it for me to venture into it. And therefore, we as a company decided it is time we bring some sort of innovation, some sort of branding, and show people what is possible since, again, our food security is always at the edge. So we set out to do this, and we did this by creating multiple subsidiaries that is going to help tackle all the various value chain. So FiaCare is one of the subsidiaries under Farming in Africa that really provide capacity building and services for all farmers across Africa. And then FiaGrow Ventures, which is basically the input part. How do we not just talk about the innovation, but also provide the input that is required to do it? And obviously, Fia Studio has been sort of the engine of awareness for our company, making sure that every African hears about what we are doing and the impacts of what good practices in agriculture can have on our continent, the planet, and in our food security as well. We didn't just do that without also having a farm that is dedicated for research, learning, and development. So in order for us to really show people and talk about it, we wanted to be the ones that have tried their hands on it. The technology, does it work? Because most of the time we do see a lot outside, and the notion is that this might not work in Africa. So how do we twist those technologies, innovations, practices to make sure that it suits our environment before we actually share it with with the continent? Therefore, we establish different farms across the country to be able to practice and learn every innovation that we see out there or we come up with. So that is a brief history about farming in Africa. We have been operating for the past 5 years in livestock industry in Ghana. Now to the main topic, which is climate inclusive actions. So what does it mean when we talk about inclusive climate actions? So we believe that all efforts that we put together, for example, this meeting, the amazing presentation and data that Nicholas presented, right, needs to benefit everyone. Climate change happens and is felt everywhere. But again, we cannot do it within a small cohort or within a sector or within a specific continent and expect everybody to know. It needs to benefit everyone. As Nicola said in his presentation as well, it mostly affects the most vulnerable people, which in our case is women, the youth, the smallholders, and people in the rural communities. And therefore, we believe that every action, every step that we take should be a step that will benefit everyone in that inclusion action. Um, Here in Farming in Africa, how are we approaching this inclusive climate action, journey or mission? When I would say, we do so by number one, creating awareness. Obviously, when I talk about awareness, it always reminds me of my mom. I grew up in a very small village in the middle belt of Ghana, and my mom is a farmer. He's been a farmer. I was born into the farm, so he's been a subsistent farmer all her life. And COVID, I got to spend a lot of time with her. And one evening, we were just sitting by the fire after dinner, talking, and she was complaining. I think she saw the moon, and she said something about, "Oh, now that the moon is out, there's not going to be any rain. Oh God, what is happening?" And he made this like, I don't know, like he was very sure. He knew the times that the rains were supposed to come and the time he's supposed to plant her maize and all that. So she said it by just looking at the moon. And I said to her, "Mom, you know that there's something called climate change. And if we do not change the way we've been farming over years, it's going to even be worse because we're cutting down the trees, burning the bushes. It's going to have an impact on how things used to be in the past." And when I said it, she took it very lightly because to her, the rain comes by God and God determines, which is true and plays a role, but our actions as human beings can also interrupt some of the gifts that God has given to us. So we had this short discussion, and I passed by, and I think after a couple of years, he called me again and says, "Hey, what you told me over the fire might be true because right now we don't understand. For the past 3 years, things haven't been working the way we used to. We're able to predict and plant our crops, but now it doesn't work that way." And anywhere he stands in his community to talk about farming, he says, "My son said, there's something called climate change." So I think this awareness campaign and being able to get it to the most vulnerable and the youth and the women is very key. And that's why through FIA Studio, we are able to, create this awareness among the youth and as far as it can reach. But then creating that awareness as people become conscious of it, they also needs the education. So what's next? What do we do now? So educating them on the practices, the ways and means we can all save this planet and contribute to the right practices is also key. And that's one thing that we take very seriously when it comes to the content that we produce on all social media about education. Then the last step is people have the knowledge, they have the information, but how do they achieve that? Are you just telling us things that are beyond us, or are you telling us things that are in the future? How do we achieve, the climate actions or practice that you're talking about? So really going down and offering them that solution, by leveraging on what the developed countries and world have practiced and is working, and customizing that to fit our culture and our environment is very key so that people just do not talk about it or wear t-shirts, but actually have the practical, um, you know, practical knowledge and tools and skills and everything to actually implement it. And we believe that with these three steps, we hope to contribute to the inclusion of combating climate change. I talked a lot about how we do this, but we are very famous on social media talking about YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, because that's where these youth are, and that's where the young men and women found themselves, and mostly maybe the age as well these days. And we spend majority of our days and times there, if not lives. And over the past 3 years, we've been deliberate about doing these three steps and showcasing what is possible in Africa. And for the past 3 years, we've grown our followers across to about 700,000 followers that are just interested in agriculture, good agricultural practice content. I mean, sometimes when I see this, I remember when I started and it was just my phone and I couldn't even show my face because I was like, who will be interested in knowing how to do livestock farming? But here we are, just putting ourselves out there and preaching the good news. We have these people across the continent following us on a day-to-day basis to just learn about the impact we are making and how they can do things the right way. On a weekly basis, in a good time, we're looking at about 5 million people across all social media viewing the content that we are putting there, trickling that down to about a daily contact or engagement of about 1,500 people, right? I don't think I ever imagined when I started this company that there will be a day that over 1,500 people will be reaching us via WhatsApp, via Facebook, via all the messages out there, wanting to learn more from us, wanting to have access to more information, and so on and so forth. And therefore, I think it has really shown us the power of social media and how we can take advantage of it in the fight against climate actions and so on. So let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the three key focuses for us. I promise this is going to be a short presentation, so I'm going to try and run through it so that I will leave room for questions. Like I said, so with all these 700,000 people following, with 5 million people on a weekly basis viewing, what are we trying to do? Number one is to really empower men and women through these social media platforms about what we can do, the best practices, adopting the best climate smart practices. And like I said, we have a farm by ourselves, so we are able to show them and not just speak it or take pictures that they cannot relate to, but really show them what we are doing in Ghana, which is very easily to be replicated in Nigeria, in Uganda, in South Africa, and in any part of the African continent as well. So having access to this practical knowledge on Facebook and YouTube really gives them that hope, right? And again, I like to also call myself a young man, so definitely relating to people like me, seeing the face and not anymore our grandfathers with wretched clothes and holding a machete, but seeing a young educated man doing this really do empower, and day in, day out, they keep us going by sending us inspirational messages about how they have been inspired by the way we are farming and the practices that we are putting in place. So we're hoping that in the next 5-10 years to come, definitely we will be able to make a massive impact in fighting climate change through agriculture and our practices on social media. The other aspect is just being deliberate about gender and including women in that conversation, in that leadership exhibition of what they do. And therefore, on our platforms, we do, visit women in agriculture that are doing amazing work, that are combating climate change. There is a woman in Tamale called Nineme who reached out to us. She is a science teacher at a high school and reached out to us about one of the things he's seen us doing. And as a teacher, he knows better. And therefore, as the dry season is approaching, one of her biggest worry is that his herdsmen are going to be taking cattle grazing in the forest, and they might not even come back to her, or they might have to cut, sometimes to the point of cutting down a tree so that the cattle can eat the branches of it, to the point of burning the bushes so that the grasses can regrow faster. All these things were contributing to climate impact and things that were worrying her as an educated livestock farmer. So Nyineme reached out to us wanting some of our solutions that we use in combating climate change in the dry season. And I'm very happy and excited anytime I go to Tamale in the northern part of Ghana to visit her, where he now has a ranch and has a feed solution, a pasture that he's feeding his livestock on, and therefore they do not have to go out, which again solves a lot of issues between the community and livestock farmers. So such women like Kineme and so many others are what we deliberately also exhibit and portray in our videos online to inspire more young women and people that want to go into the agriculture. So this deliberate action definitely contributes into including women and the youth in general in our efforts in the inclusion of climate change. Then the most critical part is, like we talked about, the third part, which is the practical solutions. So like I said, in the story of Nineveh, droughts in the northern region has always been a huge challenge. And due to climate change, now it's even worse. Recently, I was in Tamale, maybe about a month or two ago, and you could see vast size of lands that have been plowed waiting to plant their crops, and because they are very sure that within this month there should be rain, and that's how it's been over years. But all of a sudden there is no rain, and all these lands and all these farmers are sitting idle, waiting for the miracle to happen. And those that took the faith and planted suffered a severe loss because they had no rain for the plants or the crops to grow. These are real incidents that is impacting the economics of farmers, the lives of farmers, and our planet as well, and food security. And therefore, when it comes to livestock farming, that is when we have seeds that are drought resistant so that livestock farmers can grow and be able to have their livestock still being fed in the dry season without causing any conflict in their community or having to cut down the trees or burn the bushes that are left behind. And one thing that we have always been missing in our company is we have a limit, because not everybody have access to technology to be able to assess the content that we put out there. So for the past 3 years, that have been one of the biggest burden. It's like, how do we go beyond the technology and assess the most vulnerable, like my mom, in the communities that might not pick a phone and go to YouTube or go to Instagram and see what we are doing? And that is why we made the effort to get in touch with the ABF grant. And I remember the first day I walked into Unjust office, welcomed me and showed me what I needed to do. And it was the first time we have actually sought for help to how do we take our practices from online to the people that truly needs it on the ground. And therefore, being part of this matching grant fund is giving us that opportunity to break the gap between those that are exposed to technology versus those that doesn't have access to it. So with this grant, now we're able to move our team from online and be able to go on the ground and engage with these women, educate them, show them the right ways, and be able to really relate and empower them as well, as much as we are doing online. So we are hoping to do more than what we've been able to do online, where we can empower as many women and inspire them to do the right thing. Like we said, we can't leave anyone behind, and everybody needs to benefit from this action to combat climate change. The impact. So farmers can learn, and they want to learn. I always go back to social media, and we are now the biggest agri influencer in the whole of Africa. And I look at entertainment channels, I look at sports channels, I look at news channels. Those are things that I would think excites people when people want to learn or go on and entertain themselves on a daily basis. Never did I know that agriculture was something that people cared so much about and wanted to invest into it. And have also learned that every African is a farmer at heart. I mean, even if you grew up in the city, we all knew where our food was coming from. In a way or the other, we were all related in a way to what we ate. So we knew the importance of agriculture, and just that we haven't really been shown the best way to do it, the commercial aspect of it, and paint a better picture or brand to us. So farmers are willing to learn. The farmer by my side is Fatima, who traveled all the way. She's a lawyer in the UK, but is from Liberia, and traveled all the way from the UK to Ghana because he has seen the work we are doing on the social media and has a passion to start a goat farm, and therefore wanted to come and see for herself and see if what she's seeing online is truly done in Africa. She came, saw it, we share our experience with her. And as I'm talking to you now, her farm manager has come from Liberia, living at our farm for the next 1 month, just to learn the day-to-day practices and the innovative way of farming. And these are some of the things we want to scale and be able to do and really not leave anybody behind. And with that being said, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for giving us this opportunity to share with you what we do through social media, the power that it can have on our generation, considering gender as well, and the impact of this ABF matching grant to really bridge the gap that we have been feeling for years and being able to go on the ground and do the work that we do online as well. Thank you so much. And I will end here for questions.
Thank you very much, Fred, for this very powerful and interesting input. It's always good to also have like experience from the ground and how the evidence base and the data that we have can also be translated into action, which is kind of like a key step. Once again, I encourage each and everyone to post questions in the chat if there are any. I will also make sure to post a link to your YouTube channel or maybe also your website, because I think from there everyone can also find the access to all social media channels that you use. And in the meantime, maybe let me start with the first question in the chat, which kind of like relates a bit to your business model and how to integrate like this inclusiveness in a business model. So the question would be, farming in Africa is a private business. So how do you see your actions reaching and positively impacting smallholders and vulnerable households with regards to your business model? So how does this inclusiveness fit into your business model?
Yeah. Am I muted? Okay, great. So yes, being a private sector doesn't mean that we cannot have an impact. I think it all depends on the vision of the company. And my story has always been, I studied social entrepreneurship. So my journey has always been about impacting people. And therefore, when I started this company, the reason why we actually went online was to be able to share our experience. Fortunately, I do not have even a degree in agriculture or anything. So the passion comes from being able to learn, make the mistakes, and share it with everybody on the continent and beyond so that they can benefit from that. I think that alone is a huge impact. In terms of smallholder farmers, I think that is why we realized that when we were online, we were getting the middle class, we were getting the commercial farmers rather reaching out to us. And that is why we took the step of visiting, GIZ to say, we have created this sort of business and solution, but we are limited to how we get access to the smallholder farmers. And that's where GIZ comes in to be able to support us. So we might have the solution, but not the funding to be able to hit the smallholder farmers. And that is why we're doing this. So yes, our business model suit for investment and people that have the capital to start. We are working with nonprofit government agencies to be able to assess the smallholder farmers who might not be able to go on the internet or maybe even come reach us to do business with us. So we're trying to do both at the same time.
Thank you very much for your answer. It also really fits into like, I think, a
Hopefully
growing
that
number.
answers the question.
Yes, I think so. Maybe also just on a side note, I mean, we have this growing number of social businesses that do not only focus like on maximizing their profits, but also really have this impact or this contribution to solving like challenges that we see for societies, fit into their business models without being an NGO then in the end, but rather investing their profits to really scale up the solution. So that's also quite nice to see. And I think your answer already relates to the second question that I can see in French in the chat. So first of all, thank you very much for this sharing of your experience which is really motivating for young people. This as a comment on your input. And the question would be, and I think you just started to touch upon it, on the private financing component you also mentioned. So coming like the fundings that come from financial institutions, how were you able to find a solution to overcome this challenge as a young person involved in breeding or livestock? Because as you said, it's maybe not the most attractive value chain. People have this image of 2, 3 cows and the man walking behind them. So how could you really overcome the challenge of finding like financial support for your idea?
Um, that's a good question, and a question I get a lot from the youth. That anytime they approach us is, how did you finance it? How can I finance it? And I would say I was fortunate enough to have a good start in my career. So I moved to Ghana to start one of the biggest tech companies in the world. So through that, I knew where my passion lies. So the moment I left that company, I knew what I wanted to do. And so through my savings, I was able to do that. So mostly the advice I give to young people is, wherever you are, start saving, start with a plan. Once you plan and you save, right, then when the time is right, you can make the move and be able to live your dreams. But you can just jump one day and expect to achieve it. So it takes a lot of planning, savings towards it, and being very committed to it, so that you make the jump. Because yes, there might be even free funding out there, but everybody that wants to give you money wants to see what you have done, the effort you have put into it before that. So my company has been financed internally. We started very small, and that's one advice that I give to young people as well. Don't look at where we are today. Start small with what you have. I started with 2 goats in my backyard, right next to my house. And then as time goes on, bought a land and then grew from there to the point where, now we can call ourselves commercial farmer with all these various companies. So you start small with what you can, and then you work towards growing that. And since then, we have been internally funded until we became a partner to the ABF fund.
Thank you very much. This recommendation to start small with what you have, like build on the resources that you have, and then take it step by step while having a vision that you want to work towards too. I think that's quite a good takeaway. I can see a question that refers to the education and training that you all also do, but maybe because we are talking about the financial side of your business and business model, I would take like the last question that I can see in the chat first, which refers to what immediate areas of highest investment for smallholder farmers could you see when it comes to adaptation strategies to climate change? So I think it also refers to, we have limited resources available, be it like on the business level, be it maybe also on the national level when it comes to the countries and their policies. So where would you see, or what areas would you see that investment is maybe needed first, and where would you invest or channel your investments? Can you give like any recommendations building on your experience?
I think in terms of investment, as a private person going into agriculture and being, there is the value change, is big, right from the production stage to the end product landing on our plate, on our table, and therefore I think it starts with, from our company side, when we're looking at where to invest. I think we're looking at capacity building more, because as much as there is high demand for what we are doing, we also do not have enough supply to meet it, right? So we're looking at how do we train more people, how do we inspire more people to venture into this, and how do we again guide them to do things right, so that at the end of the day we can meet the goal we are looking for, but also without destroying our planet. So I think now we're very focused on the service component of our company, which is fair care, by training the farmers. First of all, I mean, we did a training last week, Friday, and it was an institution, teachers that just want to go into farming. So they are inspired, but do they have the knowledge on where to start, what to do in order to yield the results? So I think we find ourselves in a very critical role where we have the opportunity to direct people on the right path to achieve their goal and also make a good impact in the environment. So I think that's where we're really looking at our investing our time and resources with this opportunity that we've created, where many young people and livestock farmers in Africa are looking up to us. And therefore, we have a huge responsibility to be able to guide them. So this is a conversation I was having last week with one of my team members, and I was saying the focus for us this coming years is training, because we've built the awareness, we've built the publicity. Now we have to show people the right way of doing things. Otherwise, it's going to circle back and harm us. So that's where we are putting our efforts and investments now.
Thank you very much. I can see like lots of interest in your business model, in your rollout, going beyond Ghana in the chat. So maybe I would make use of the role as a moderator to maybe advise those that are really interested to learn more about farming in Africa, to consult your website, and maybe also coming back a bit more on the inclusive climate action angle that we want to bring in. You just mentioned that you want to have the focus on training really this year, and there's also a question in the chat if you have any training courses online or on site. So maybe you can touch upon a bit on that. But I would really be interested in learning maybe from your experience on how to mobilize young people and women, because what we can experience often, be it when conducting activities ourselves or when we have discussion with partners, that a common experience is like, we would be interested in mobilizing more women or making them participate, but it's really like a challenge. We can also see it in our e-learning that the numbers of female participants are a bit lower than those of male. So do you have any recommendations building on your experience on how to really mobilize like young people and maybe women specifically?
Yeah, I definitely see that, but fortunately for us, that hasn't been a problem. It has actually been a much more demanding. I remember last week we had about 3 invitations from different institutions, the police, the prisons, and a technical university, for us to come and engage with them. And I mean, because of the work we do online, you get there and they already know about what we do and say, whoa, if you guys are here, why not? You know, we went to a university last 2 weeks wanting to engage the students, and the principal said, no, we want you to engage the teachers first. So are you ready in 2 days? Because we want to meet you and learn from you, because we all have sheep and goats on campus. So talk to us first before the students. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to encounter that. But I think the best way, to mobilize the youth and be part of this is to get to their level where they are. I think climate change itself, is discussion. It's mostly not the most fun thing to talk about, the science behind it and so on. So sometimes could seem boring to people, but I think once we come to their level and break it down on social media and well represented by more youth talking about it as compared to people they can relate or people from outside the environment, then becomes easy for them to show interest in it. So I would say for us to get more of the youth involved in our webinars, in our trainings, we need to be able to relate to them. We need to bridge the gap. How do we merge their interest versus what we want to learn? I always say, if a kid is enjoying what he's doing, he will learn anyways, right? Because he's having fun. He thinks he's having fun, but in actual sense, he's also learning something. So how do we make our topics, our engagement with them more fun, so that they might show interest, or just by that create that awareness from that point? Because I think we are able to solve that problem because they have seen us on YouTube or Facebook doing something. The first day might not interest them, but the second thing might excite them, and then the connection is being built so that when we meet them in person, it's much easier.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe then, as a last question to wrap up this very interesting conversation, I liked your reference to your mother and how she changed her mind from like accepting all those changes just as given, but then making the shift and saying, aha, maybe you had a point, like the climate change might be real. And I could imagine like someone like your mother spreading that message could be quite a powerful tool, right? To have those role models, let's say it like that, be it in person, that you have people in communities that can really convey messages like that. But then also when it comes to social medias, and when we talk about influencers, and you probably also have like lots of experience with that. So maybe you can share a sentence on two, or on your experience on how important role models could be, and how to maybe make use of them to really convey those messages and make those changes. And if there are any reactions, as you also said that in your YouTube videos, for example, you also always pay attention to share stories of women. Are there any specific reactions, really, like maybe also from other female agripreneurs that are encouraged because they can see like a female role model talking about the issues and how to address them?
Yeah, maybe taking it from the bottom to even the young women. We went to a school, and in high school in Ghana, there is the agric department, there is business, there is science, and so on and so forth. And the agric department has only one class. Business has about 4 or 5. Science have different classes. But then when you go to agric, it's just one. And most of the time, 90% of the people in the agric sector wanted to be science students. And because for some reason the science class were full, or even their grades weren't good enough, they were brought into the agric science department. So we made it an effort to engage with them. And once you go there, you hear, just like you're saying, women and young men in the class saying, okay, now I have hope. I know I'm not in the wrong space because I was brought here because of this and that. So the generation that we are building from the education or the institution stage even don't have the self-confidence to get there. And therefore, a role model being able to stand there, and me telling them that I wish I had started from an agri school, I would have been doing much better than now. I wish I didn't have to go into health technology, transport technology before finding my path into agriculture, right? So role model plays a huge role, and that is one of the things that we are doing in person as well, to be able to do that. And bringing it all the way to my mom. My mom had the opportunity to have a son who is educated and knowledgeable about climate change, to be able to tell her about that, even though in the beginning she wasn't very, the reception to it wasn't great. She's seen evidence of it, and it's gradually converting her, to be a disciple and evangelist of climate change. And I think that is the impact when we create the awareness, or we start making deliberate efforts to it. We are just sowing a seed one step at a time, right? And we hope that in a few, months, years to come, we will all at least be aware and conscious about action, whether in agriculture or any industry that we find ourselves.
Thank you very much. And once again, as we are running out of time, thank you very much for the most interesting input and being available to answer all their questions. Once again, also thank you very much to Nick from FAO for presenting the insights from the report. I'm aware that we could not address all of the questions in the chat, so I would once again encourage you to just consult the website of Farming in Africa, Africa to learn more about their stories and ways, as well as their social media channels, where you can get like a lot of information, maybe also on the questions that you have asked in the chat that were maybe not that geared towards the inclusive climate action angle. Yeah, to wrap up this webinar and this expert talk, maybe I would also like to share an information on our Agribusiness e-Academy, and my colleagues have already shared the information in the chat. As you might know, we also have this Agribusiness e-Academy, where we provide self-paced and freely accessible online courses or e-learning courses. One of our flagship courses is the Agribusiness Agriculture as Business course. But as we are talking about inclusive climate action, today we wanted to also inform you that we will launch a series of courses that specifically focus on climate smart agribusiness. And the first course on climate smart agribusiness essentials will be launched very, very soon. So the English version should be available in October or November, featuring 2 sessions. So really explaining all the basics when it comes to understanding climate change, but then also making the link to climate change and agribusiness, so how they impact each other. And then in the course of, or by the end of this year, the beginning of next year, we will also launch a specific course on climate smart agribusiness when it comes to adaptation to climate change, as well as a course when it comes to mitigation. We will also launch these courses in other languages, including in French, maybe a bit later than the English version. So we expect the French version of the first course to be available in December or January latest. Yes, so we have already come to the end of our expert talk. Let me once again thank each and every one of you for your participation and also for your questions. And once again, a great thank you to our 2 speakers that really provided, I think, valuable insights, be it like more on the data side that really creates this evidence base when it comes to climate vulnerability and why it's so important to be inclusive when it comes to climate action, as well as like the more practical experience on the ground on how it can look like when you really put it into practice. Thank you very much to each and every one of you, and have a good day, and hopefully see you soon for our next expert talk. We have already shared the announcement with you in the invitation to this expert talk. The next one will take place in mid-October, and we would be happy to see you back then. Goodbye.